Now, what was I telling you about?
We were talking about a Protestant customer.
Oh yes, yes, and this Protestant customer devised a machine for making, what would you call them? Containers, I suppose is the best word, for honey. You know the timber pieces that you put in, when you're selling it, you sell the honey in these wooden containers.
Mm-hmm.
They're little pieces of timber on the four sides of a square of honey, whatever you call the wax things.
Is the boards, is it, with the wax on them? No.
No. You put these into the hive,
Uh-huh.
and the bees fill them with honey themselves.
Okay.
You see, but the pieces of timber have to be made in a special design.
Mm-hmm.
But he designed a machine that would cut out the timber into this shape. And he went into the business of making them. He had the machine for making them in his garage. he had to get money to set it up and all that. So he went to my father, and my father gave him the money to do this, which was totally off the wall, really, as an enterprise. But it actually turned out very successful, and he made a lot of money out of it and paid back the overdraft, and everything was grand. But it's just an example of the kind of thing my father was willing to do, but the boards of the banks were horrified at this. He had a limit, you see, of the amount that he could lend himself without reference to the board.
Yes.
£300.
Yes.
And that was common. That was the usual amount that bank managers had as a limit that they could lend themselves. Anything in excess of that, they had to get permission from the board in Dublin to allow the overdraft. And it was usually an overdraft that the lending was done.
Would you talk just for a minute about what the area was like in Magherafelt, and when he built up the branch, what that all involved? Was he primarily lending to farmers, or was he lending to local businesses? Or?
No, he was lending principally to farmers, because there were no local businesses in Magherafelt in those days. The only shops, really, there were a few shops. There was the shop beside the bank. John McGurk was the name of the man who owned it. He was a Catholic, and he had the same kind of business that my Martin Maloney had. He had a grocer's shop, and he had a pub license as well. But most of the Catholic shops in Magherafelt were pubs. I can only think of one other grocery shop that was owned by a Catholic. But there were several pubs that were owned by Catholics.
Because presumably your father would have worked in his father's shop when he was a youth.
I would expect he did.
And
yes.
he probably knew the business pretty well.
He did. Probably.
But he wasn't lending to businesses mainly, he was lending to farmers.
No,
and he wasn't a farmer himself, or he had no farming background.
Well, he when he was young, as a boy, he had spent a lot of time on his relations' farms around Hetford. So he knew quite a lot about farming, actually. And farming up in that part of County Derry is mostly potatoes. They're the main crop. There's very little wheat or barley. Some barley, yes, but very little wheat would be sown. Oats, a bit also.
And no dairy.
Very little dairying, very little.
And what about raising cattle, beef farming?
Not much of that.
No.
Not much. Pigs, yes.
Pigs.
Pigs, yes.
So it's potatoes for export to Derry and maybe Belfast, am I right,
Yes.
or other towns?
yes.
Okay.
And
Not much in that.
not much in that.
Talking small farms then.
Farms were very small. I mean, 10 acres would have been quite common. And less,
Yes.
and less.
So
5 acres.
if he's running a very profitable branch, how is he doing it?
He was doing it, you see, profit in those days, and in my time in the bank, was measured by your deposits. If your deposits were growing, it was a profitable branch.
Mm-hmm.
Now, deposits, you see, are not very profitable to the bank, because the bank pays, generally speaking, they used to pay about 5% interest. And the money of course was all transferred to Dublin, and Dublin would transfer it to London, onto the London market, and they'd only get a turnover of maybe 1.5%.
Yeah.
On 7-day money. Overnight money would be even less. And there was very little business in long-term lending, because MJ Cook didn't accept it. He wanted to be in a very liquid position. And the money that were lent, they would rarely exceed 60% of the deposits.
Yeah.
So the security and welfare of the bank were what was really important. Now the amount that they would get on a loan, you see, the loans would be about maybe 6%, so 7%. There wasn't much on those.
Mm.
There'd be a bit more on the lending with bills.
Mm.
But their amounts would be very small. They'd only lend, he'd lend maybe £20 to a farmer to buy some seed, for instance, say buy seed potatoes.
That was the equivalent of what overdraft lending would be now, I guess, isn't it?
Yes.
So
Now, there was a bit of overdraft lending, but not much. Not much over, because you see there were no industry in the area. Any industry in the area was linen,
Yeah.
and that was all in the hands of Protestants.
So just explain the bill lending just a little bit.
Pardon?
Just explain how the bill lending worked.
Oh, the bill. Well, the farmer would come in to the bank and he would ask for a loan of maybe £20 or £30. And given the right circumstances, they would agree to it, and they'd give him the money in cash there and then, and he would sign a promissory note, and the promissory note would say, "I promise to pay the National Bank Limited 3 months from today's date the sum of £20." And there might be more elaborate wording than that, but that was basically what it said. And he would sign it. And he would have to get a guarantor to sign it along with him. And usually he'd get a shopkeeper or another farmer to sign the bill with him. And he'd be handed out the £20 and he'd go off. And in 3 months' time, the bill would become due, and it would either have to be renewed or paid off after the 3 months. Now, if it was renewed, it would be renewed because crops weren't in yet. It wasn't yet the autumn, and it might be renewed for another 3 months or sometimes another 6 months. And he'd pay the interest on it there and then for the 3 months. He'd pay the interest.
I thought they were discounted that he just didn't get the full £20. Is that the way it worked?
That could happen too.
Yeah.
That could happen too. That was another way of doing it. That he wouldn't get the full £20. Yes.
Okay.
So
And what did the shopkeeper get out of it? Why would he countersign it?
because the man was a friend of his, perhaps was a customer of his.
Did he get any money out of it? No, do you think?
He did not directly.
No.
He didn't get anything out of it directly. It was indirect.
Quite a risky thing for the shopkeepers to be doing, I would have thought.
Well, they'd only do it for people that they were pretty sure of. you
Yes.
know.
Yes.
Um,
So it was small scale business, you were saying. That wasn't really a big business. And I
It
guess
wasn't-
the
it
guarantee made it impossible for it to be a big business.
it wasn't a big business, but it was big in the sense that it was very widespread.
Yes.
These people who got this money were from all over the county, you know. And the Maloney reputation grew and grew and grew. And when these people got a bit of money, they put it into the bank, even though it was a Catholic bank.
So you think that's how he was one of his techniques? By
That
being
was-
willing to lend on the bills, he was able to get in the deposits?
Yeah, it was. And the deposits were what was being looked for. The bank was always on the lookout for deposits.
And of course the bills were well within his limit.
Well within.
He could lend them out and no one could second guess him.
That's right. Yeah, well within his limit. And as I said, the amounts were small. I mean, £50
Yeah.
was quite a lot of money.
And how he assessed people? Did he know them personally, or how do you think? What do you think his technique was?
Well, his technique was that he knew the people.
And how did he come to know so many people? He was obviously a very sociable man. If he knew so many people.
He that's a hard question to answer. I don't really know the answer to that, because he wasn't very social. Now, when he was drinking, yes, you know, he'd be in the pub all day, and he'd meet people there. But that wasn't really a very good basis for lending money. So I don't know the answer to that question, really. How was he known? His reputation was tremendously widespread around around the whole of Mid-Ulster.
And how did you get the sense of that? That he had a reputation?
Because of people's attitude to him. You know, he was very highly regarded by everybody. I mean, the classic story is when he had retired, the building that we lived in was knocked down, and they built a new branch on the site. And the day came when the branch was to be officially declared open, and he was invited back for the occasion. And it was quite soon after he had retired. It was about maybe 4 years, let's say, or 3 years after he retired. And they had a reception in the branch, and customers from far and wide all around came. There was a huge crowd there, and he was the principal guest, really. But the branch was declared open by the chairman of the bank from London, who was Lord Pakenham. And this Protestant farmer, customer of his, came to the reception, and the present manager said to him, who had been our agent when he was there, said to him, "Come and I'll introduce you to Lord Pakenham," because he was an important customer. And his response was, I don't want to meet Lord Pakenham. I want to meet P.J. Maloney. And he was introduced back to P.J. Maloney, who he knew and who knew him, you see. And that was just indicative of the kind of reputation that he had. The wee man at the top of the diamond, they knew him as.
He was a small man, wasn't he?
He was, yes.
So my memory is maybe 5'4" or 5'5".
Something like that,
Yeah.
yes.
Stocky built,
That's right.
same as his father in a way,
Exactly. And Joe was the same,
was he?
yes.
And
Now,
John,
John
was
was
taller,
different.
I think, wasn't he?
John was tall.
Yeah. What is your memory of what he was like when you were growing up in Magherafelt? Did he have a regular routine? Did he sort of, you mentioned earlier you had a sense that he was unhappy, I think, or at times he was unhappy. What do you think his life was like in Magherafelt?
I wasn't aware of that at the time.
Right.
But looking back on it, I think that. His routine was, the bank opened at 10 o'clock. 10 o'clock would come and he'd be still in bed. He wasn't good for getting up in the morning. But the first of the staff who came in would probably send the porter upstairs for the keys. And the porter would be given the keys. My mother would probably give it, or somebody would give him. He had a place where he kept the keys. And the keys would be sent down. And with the key they could open the strong room and have access to the safe, get the money out. So that would all happen about between 9:30 and 10. Anyway, after 10 he'd get up and he'd dress himself and have his breakfast and he'd go down to the branch. Now, on a number of days of the week, he'd have to go out to a sub-office. So the tin box containing the cash and the books for the sub-office would be got ready and put into the car, which would be stopped outside the door. He'd come down and he might look at the letters or something, and he'd get into the car and drive off.
Was that a branch car or his own car?
It was his own car, but it used to be hired to the bank for these trips. Now, he'd go, I can't remember, there was nothing on a Monday. Tuesday they used to go to Draperstown and Toonbridge. Wednesday was Kilray. Kilray was a long way off, 30 miles or more.
Okay.
Thursday, I think there was nothing on a Thursday. On Friday, I think was Kilray again. So, and he used to do most of that himself. So his people's knowledge of him was spread very wide because all the people in these towns would know him.
He could have sat in the branch and sent a deputy out to do all that.
He could have, yes, but he didn't do that. And he was very well known in these branches. Oh, there was also a place, Balahi. Balahi was another one. I don't know what day of the week Balahi was on, but anyway, it was fitted in there.
My geography's not that good, but that's a large part of South Derry, is it?
Oh yes, oh very large, yes. I mean, Kilray is up north, it's on the way to Coleraine. And Draperstown was over to the west, up in the mountains. That's where I learned how to drive a car. Because there was a there was a Church of Ireland church at the top of the town, and there were trees around it on the outside. There was a big open space there, and I was put into the car and I drove it around there, and I reversed in between the trees and drove out again and all around. And that's where I learned how to drive. I used to go out with them when I'd come back from school. I used to go out on the sub-offices with them quite often. And I'd be introduced to all these people who came into the thing, you see. And, he was a very important person in all these communities. The Catholic side, of course.
Yes. So that was probably a pleasant trip for you.
Oh yes, yeah.
Was he good company?
Funny, I don't have any real recollection of that. The only thing I remember was that in order to demonstrate his magic, so to speak, he'd have me take some money out of the strong box. I'd usually take maybe half a crown or 3 shillings, something like that, you see. And he'd balance his cash at the end of the day, you see, and he'd be short this sum, and he'd tell me how much I had taken. Because, and he was very accurate in that way, you know.
Yes.
And of course I put the money back then, the whole
Yes.
thing was over. But
Did he teach you how to drive?
he did,
He did.
yes.
Can you remember what he was like as a teacher? Was he patient?
Oh yes, he was
He was.
patient. Oh yes, he was, yeah.
Was he a good teacher?
I would say he was a good teacher, yes. Yeah.
He sounds to me a bit like maybe a bit restrained as an individual, maybe not disclosing himself a lot to everybody, but clever. Maybe knew he was clever or thought he was clever. Reasonably sociable, but as I say, not overly sociable. Probably not well known by his children. Maybe would that be fair?
I think that would be true. You see, his whole life was given over to the bank. You know, he had very little to do with any of us at
Yes.
all on a daily basis. He'd be in the bank. When he came home, around about 3:30 or 4 o'clock or 4:45, he'd have his dinner. And when he had eaten it, back down to the bank he would go. And he'd be there until maybe midnight. That's when he used to do most of his work,
Wow.
was at night time. He'd come up then and he'd have the newspaper with him, and he'd sit in the dining room in front of the fire and he'd read the newspaper until maybe 2 in the morning or later. That's why he used to be 8 in the morning.
Yes, he was a
You
night
see.
bird,
He was a night bird.
and you were all fast asleep
We
then
were
for
all
most of his
asleep.
waking
And
life.
his wife was asleep
All right.
as well. Now, they occasionally, well, fairly frequently, they used to go for walks.
Yeah.
But that again had nothing to do with us.
Yeah.
We'd be at home doing our homework,
Yes.
you see. And
He'd be in the branch on his own then when he was sitting there until night.
Oh,
There'd be
yes.
nobody else there.
there'd be nobody
So it's
else.
kind of a loner's existence in some ways.
It was.
He has these bursts of sociability when he goes out to the sub branches and meets all these people and has
Yes.
these people coming into him looking for these £20 and £30 bills and so on. But then he has these long periods of time which he's obviously designed so that he gets to sit and read the paper or gets to go through the paperwork in the office
Mm.
all on his own.
Mm. Oh yes. And the other staff, you see, they'd carry on the work of the branch,
Mm.
you know, all the balancing and writing, and the correspondence was done virtually entirely by him.
Mm.
They very rarely, if ever, wrote a letter, any of them. he would do all the writing, tapping away on his typewriter.
How unusual to think he was as a branch manager. Were they all little kings of their own territories in that sense, with a personal style, do you think? I know you would have met them a lot later now in other branches, but what's just your sense of the history of the thing?
I would say they were all of the same pattern, but I think he was more exaggerated than most of them. Most of them wouldn't have spent nights after night after night in the boardroom downstairs writing letters to the board in Dublin and getting involved in controversy as to why did you lend the money to this person and why was he ever going to pay it back and so on. And all these letters would go back and forth constantly. They didn't, we were there for years before we had a telephone.
Yeah.
And it was, Dublin never rang up, and he never rang up Dublin. You know, he was very much on his own.
Yes. You mentioned earlier about the drinking.
Yes.
What was the pattern? Was it occasional? Was it sort of on a regular basis? Was it
It
sort of
was
once
about-
a year or once a month?
He'd break out maybe 3 times a year. And it would go on for weeks and weeks. And he would get more and more and more addicted to it as the time went on. And all sorts of people, doctors and priests and friends would be called in to try and talk to him and to persuade him to give this thing up, you know. And most of the time he wouldn't. And looking back on it, I think what he was looking for was freedom. He didn't want other people to tell him what to do. If he wanted to do something, he decided to do it himself. And it was only when things were getting really serious and his accountant, Tom Farrell, who was very supportive and caring for him and was very attached to him, really, as the whole staff were, you know. They'd fill in for him and do the things that he was supposed to be doing and keep the show on the road, so to speak, despite all this incapacity. Because of course when he was drinking, he was useless for anything, you know. He could hardly walk to start with, and he couldn't. It was impossible for him to work in the branch.
So you're saying he 2 or 3 times a year that he'd go on a drinking spree?
Yes, he would.
And that of drinking every day?
Oh, every day.
Like from morning to night?
From morning to night,
But
yes.
how did he actually... Did he get up at his normal time and drink, or did he just never come home, or how did he do it?
Mostly he did it by getting up, and he'd be pretty well hung over when he got